Duh.
First, there's Batman the movie. Then there's Superman the movie. Then there's Batman Returns. Then there's Superman Returns. Then there's The Dark Knight. Then there's Man of Steel, which is the movie we are talking about today. Hello everyone, I'm K-Swope, and in this video we're reviewing Man of Steel. That being said, we're going to go ahead and jump into my review. Here's how this is going to look. I'm talking about the good things about the movie, then the bad things about the movie, and then we're going to come together and discuss, give it a rating on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being the worst thing possible, complete, utter eye garbage, gouge out my eyeballs and stick them in my armpits, they're that bad. And then 10 being Citizen Kane being, one of the most well-written movies of all time, if not the most well-written movie of all time other than Paddington 2, but I digress. So, that being said, let's jump right in. The first thing about this movie that is really, really good, I have to point out, is the acting and the cast, okay? The cast of this movie, fantastic. Henry Cavill, Superman, fantastic. Amy Adams might not be a conventional choice for Lois Lane, but she does a great job with it, so I'm not complaining there. She does great. Russell Crowe as Jor-El. I would never have thought that, but he actually does a really good job in the role, I think, so that is great. And then Michael Shannon as, of course, General Zod. All great roles. Those are the people that stick out to me specifically in this cast. All great. And Henry Cavill, Superman, as of late, I know he's gotten a big cult following, and I would love to see him in the role again at some point. Maybe not, the main Superman, since we got the new James Gunn movie getting ready to come out. But either way, still, Henry Cavill, Superman, fantastic. Easily the best cast we could do. The only person that could potentially live up to Christopher Reeve's reputation is definitely Henry Cavill. I think he does a really good job at that. So, that is fantastic. I think the plot, generally, and the setup of this movie is pretty good because, we're following Superman. He's going through, the Superman stuff, and they pick a really interesting villain to kind of start things off on. And they spend a lot of time in this film with Krypton and the whole Krypton politics, which leads straight into the events of Man of Steel, which I think is very, very interesting. They kind of speed through the whole Superman origin thing, which I don't think is a bad idea, mainly because the whole Superman origin, a lot of us, we've heard it many, many times, and so we don't really need a ton of it. So instead, they spend more time talking politics on Krypton and what led to its destruction and all of that stuff, the whole General Zod conflict with Jor-El, which I think is very, very fascinating. And it sets things up in such a way where Superman has to come out and be himself, just, show up on the scene, not because he really wants to, but because he kind of has to, which is very, very fascinating. It's a really interesting way of doing it, because he probably would have been mostly in hiding all these years if it weren't for the fact that Zod shows up and is like, hey, we know you have a Kryptonian here, bring him, and we'll all be fine. So that makes for an interesting story. And there's one thing I gotta say about this movie. It is that it's very unconventional, which doesn't make it bad, it's just something interesting to note. I will say this. The Superman suit in this film, very unconventional, but it looks really good and is very, very iconic for this stage, this era of superhero films and DC. So it's not my favorite suit personally. However, when I see Henry Cavill in that Superman suit, there's just a special little part of me that kind of gets excited and, ooh, nostalgia, that kind of thing. So the Henry Cavill suit, great. Of course, I mentioned Henry Cavill, fantastic, but he looks awesome in that suit as well. It is very clearly, unmistakably Superman. It's just not your conventional Superman look. Because as you can see, my shirt, this is a classic Superman logo. This is what everyone kind of, I guess, expected to see. I think a lot of people may have wanted to see that when the movie came out, and they did not go that direction at all with the suit design. But I still like what we got. It's very unconventional, but I still think it's really good. I also think this movie is very fascinating because it's really the first mainstream story we get where we see a more gritty Superman, which is something that I quite appreciate seeing. We've seen all kinds of, different realistic gritty Superman interpretations since then, Injustice and stuff, being an evil Superman and things like that. And we've seen other stories where there's Superman-esque characters who are dark and gritty, some, of course, also being the evil Superman stereotypes like Homelander, Omni-Man, stuff like that. But this, of course, is not evil Superman. This is just gritty Superman. So I think that's very interesting. It's not necessarily something that's going to make it any better, but it's not something to make it worse either. And I think that's very, very fascinating. But either way, I think this movie, the whole tone of it and the vibe, it just feels very, reminiscent of a certain time. Feels very Zack Snyder-y. And I kind of like it. I'm a big fan of Zack Snyder. I like a lot of his work. I also got to say, I think my favorite part of this movie might just be the first 20 minutes, to be quite honest, because that's the entire whole thing on Krypton. the planet's getting ready to collapse. Jor-El's telling people, hey, we got to do stuff or else, it's literally doomsday today. And, all kinds of stuff here and there. So he's like, screw it, I'm going to take it into my own hands. And he starts feuding with his brother and stuff, which eventually leads him blast his son off into space to Earth with a bunch of special trinkets and fancy blah, 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 whatever, Kryptonian stuff, knowledge, blah, 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 DNA, whatever, you get what I say. But that whole bit, I think, is very interesting because we've seen the Krypton stuff and the whole Zod and Jor-El kind of thing dynamic. This is very fascinating because it really does feel like doomsday for Krypton in this movie, in these 20 minutes specifically. And I kind of enjoy seeing that. I think it's very, very fascinating. I also don't think in the comics they've spent a whole lot of time talking about, what was taking place on Krypton building up to the explosion. I know, they've referenced things here and there. We get like a brief idea, but this feels very original to me, and I think maybe that's why I love it so much. But like I said, the first 20 minutes, fantastic. I like it. However, this is where I'm going to get into the bad stuff. The first 20 minutes, great. The rest of the movie, not that it's bad, it's just way too long if you ask me. The movie's like, I want to say like, what is it, like 2.5 hours? And I feel like it just didn't need to be that long. The problem is not with the length itself. It's with, I guess, the pacing, what's going on, because honestly, it's kind of boring at times, not going to lie. Like when they're fighting in Smallville and, tearing things up and then, the big battle when they basically destroy most of Metropolis. That's interesting stuff, don't get me wrong. Kind of like everything building up in between that. Again, first 20 minutes, great. We go through a brief origin story, Clark Kent origin story kind of thing with him on Earth. And then, we get straight into the plot of things. And I don't know, it has a hard time keeping my interest, I'm not going to lie. It's kind of boring, kind of too long. I think they just could have cut a lot and it would have just moved a lot better and I would have liked it a lot more. Something else I got to mention that I referenced earlier, they basically almost everybody in Metropolis in that final fight, and that is brutal. Now, don't get me wrong, I like the idea that Zack Snyder has here, talking about, the power of Superman, because that's going to lead up to a very interesting, and I think a very worthwhile conversation in Batman vs. Superman. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, though. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. In this film, it is absolutely berserk, and I think anyone who just has a familiarity with Superman and not having a Superman movie since like 2006, I think it was at this point, if I'm not mistaken, with Superman Returns, and they come into Man of Steel, they're probably in for a lot of shocks because, that's pretty insane. I think when most people generally think of Superman, they don't think of that. I'm not saying it's technically a bad thing per se, having the bad side just because it's unorthodox and kind of weird. But it's definitely a shock, and it's something that I think a lot of, oh, Sonny, there's a new Superman movie out. I remember back in my day, Christopher Reeve, blah, 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 blah. Then they go and see this and just see, Zod and Superman in this massive fight, just like destroying all of Metropolis, like countless people, is just like literally insane. That's crazy. Now, I'm really torn, though, with this point specifically, because like I said, I don't hate it per se. I think it's technically a net negative. However, I feel like it's so worth it for what I think comes later on. Now, that does not mean, though, that it makes this film better, because technically, everything in a single film is supposed to build up to making that film better and more complete. There should be no loose ends. There should be nothing like that here and there. And I do feel like when they're off everybody in Metropolis for the most part, that's not a good note to end on, and they don't really get much resolution from that in this movie. And I hate that, honestly. So generally I have to lump that idea into the bad section. I do have one note. There's another thing I'm really neutral on. It's Superman killing Zod. A lot of people have a real big issue with that. Honestly, I kind of don't understand why, because if we're being realistic here, and Superman is fighting someone who's just as powerful as he is, should not be off the table, because I already told you, everyone in Metropolis in that fight just, it was insane. Like, the whole city almost got completely leveled. I mean, he's only going to do worse if he's not stopped. So I don't blame him for that morally. People have complaints about him just being able to snap his neck like that. But I'm thinking to myself, I mean, they kind of balance each other out, do they not? Because they're both powered by the same sun. In fact, say Clark probably has the upper hand there too, because he's been exposed to the yellow sun longer than Zod has. So, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to me. Again, neither good nor bad. I will say, though, I'm just going to jump back to the bad here. Sorry for going all over the place. But another thing in this movie I was thinking about just today is I once heard, and this is really, really good piece of advice. It was Trey Parker and Matt Stone. There's a video of them where they're like guest speaking at a class somewhere, college class, talking about writing. And what they're doing is they're explaining how whenever you're writing a story, you should not write things and go, okay, this happens, and then this happens, and then this. No, that's a terrible idea. The idea is you write something, and then you say, okay, so because this, and then that, and then this. And so basically you're taking all of the ideas, if you will, and you are kind of moving them to their next logical point and conclusion. Or this was set in motion, so now this happens, and then because this happens, this happens. And so that's a really good rule of thumb, really good tool. And I feel like there's a lot of points in this movie where they just kind of show scenes and stuff. I guess we're supposed to just add for context that I really just don't think add much. Like, especially when we're looking at a Clark Kent when he's, you know, an oil thing and he saves people. I get why they're showing that. I don't think they need to show that. That's the thing, because it doesn't really do anything else in the plot later on. All it does is show you pieces of Clark's character, which we would have been able to pick up, because for one, he's Superman. Everybody knows Superman. They're always going to act, right? So there's that, and then also the fact that we get to see, I think, a little more of his altruism later on as we go, right? So, you know, we kind of have an idea of this already. Like, we saw the little bit with him saving the kids on the school bus, okay, when he was a kid. Like, we really don't need that scene. It's like, okay, we get the point. You don't need to keep showing us examples of this. So my conclusion for this movie, okay, and then we're going to give it a rating here, is really interesting, because if you look at the tomato meter score for Man of Steel, it currently lies at a 57% critic rating. And surprisingly, that's more or less my opinion, because I give it a 6 out of 10 because I don't love Man of Steel. Like, I really don't have any desire to go back and rewatch this, other than the fact that I'm doing this review, to be quite honest. However, it's not a bad movie. It just could be a better movie, I guess. And that's kind of what I think about it. Again, I think it sets up some stuff that I really am going to like later on, which we'll talk about in later reviews. Mark my words, trust me. But in the meantime, it's all right. It's okay. I mean, it gets a 6 out of 10. It's decent. I don't love it. I would recommend it to a few people, maybe. Definitely not if this is your first exposure to Superman. But ladies and gentlemen, that is my review of Man of Steel. Let me know what you guys think. Do you like this movie? Do you hate this movie? I want to know what you think. I know we have a lot of diverse opinions among my subscribers, so I want to know what you guys thought of this film. And hey, if you're excited for what I'm going to review next, which is going to be Batman vs. Superman, by the way, little spoiler there, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because I will be reviewing that next week is the plan. So until then, ladies and gentlemen, I'm K Swope, and I will see you in the next one.